I want to welcome Secretary Anthony Foxx. He's here today in his first appearance before our subcommittee to talk about his department's budget request and our nation's transportation policy. So thank you very much for being here. Many Americans are still struggling in what remains a tough economy, and we need to continue to focus on investments that create jobs and opportunity, as well as make transportation safe and reliable. So I look forward today to a discussion about how this budget supports our communities and economy and tackles our transportation infrastructure deficit fairly and responsibly. It was only 2 months ago that Congress passed legislation to fund the government for the rest of fiscal year 2014, and that achievement came after several years of gridlock and was made possible because members on both sides of the aisle recognized the need for solutions rather than continued disruption and crisis. At the end of last year, I worked with Chairman Ryan to reach a 2-year bipartisan budget deal. Our budget rolled back some of the automatic across-the-board cuts to priorities like education, infrastructure, and research. It prevented another government shutdown and restored some certainty and stability to families and communities, and did it in a balanced way without relying on spending cuts alone. The agreement made it possible for the Appropriations Committee to not only complete its work and send a bill to the President that funds the government for the rest of 2014, but it also allowed us to get started on our work for this year, 2015. The modest increases in the omnibus mean the FAA can replace retiring air traffic controllers, avoiding the sequester-driven furloughs that disrupted air travel a year ago. It means no interruption in transit projects now under construction across the nation, from Texas to my home state of Washington and to your hometown, Mr. Secretary, Charlotte. It also means there will be more safety inspectors overseeing the safe shipment of millions of tons of hazardous materials that move through our cities and towns each year. I'm pleased the budget deal restored a degree of stability to the department's core functions. However, there is still more to be done. Almost half of the funding available to this subcommittee comes from the Highway Trust Fund, which once again is at risk of insolvency. Beginning this summer, the fund is expected to face shortfalls that would force the department to begin slowing payments, putting projects at risk and potentially harming state and local economies. If Congress does not act within a year, these shortfalls are projected to increase dramatically, making it impossible for state and local governments to maintain the road and transit networks that commuters and businesses depend on. That's why I was glad to see the President propose paying for new investments in transportation infrastructure with revenue raised through reforming the bloated and loophole-ridden corporate tax code. House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Dave Camp included a similar proposal in the Republican tax reform plan he released last week. Now that both Democrats and Republicans have proposed using revenue from the corporate tax code to invest in our transportation system and make sure the Highway Trust Fund remains solvent, so states and communities can continue work on infrastructure projects vital to economic growth, I am really hopeful that we can all work together to get this done in the coming months. Because helping to create jobs here at home, rather than letting corporations send jobs overseas to avoid paying taxes, is good for our budget, it is good for our economy, and it makes sense. The President's proposal focuses on prudent investments, beginning with fixing our existing infrastructure. In a nation where 1 of 9 bridges today is rated deficient and transit systems have an estimated maintenance backlog of $86 billion, the emphasis on bringing the infrastructure we currently have into good state of repair makes sense. So does the department's focus on stronger investment in freight networks that make it cheaper and faster to move goods to market and improves access to jobs and education, so we increase opportunities for all Americans. These are priorities that will help our economy as well as our communities compete in the global marketplace. This subcommittee has long supported investments that tackle the complex transportation needs of our communities through the TIGER program, which I created and first funded in the Recovery Act. Since then, TIGER has now awarded $3.6 billion to support innovative, multimodal projects in every state. Demand for these funds is intense. Applications always exceed the amount of funding available, sometimes as much as 20 to 1, which is why I appreciate the President's proposal would more than double the size of the program and fund the program through the Highway Trust Fund. I know firsthand the kind of difference Tiger has made from my home state. Back in 2010, a bridge on the main access road to commerce for a community in South Seattle was crumbling and had to be closed. The local business owners and residents of that community that I spoke with said the bridge, which used to carry as many as 20,000 vehicles a day, was their lifeline. In 2010, the South Park Bridge won a Tiger grant that provided the last critical piece of financing they needed to help rebuild that bridge. And the project itself created badly needed jobs that helped the entire community weather some pretty tough economic times. In this May, in a few short months, a new bridge is going to open, providing a strong foundation that will serve that community for generations to come. And that's just one example of what can happen when we invest in our communities and in our infrastructure. But even though I'm glad the department's budget request includes good investments in our transportation programs, we also need the department to be a leader in innovation and safety. Unfortunately, there are times when the department is not always living up to that expectation and finds itself reacting. In 2011, the American Association of Railroads petitioned for an improved tank car design to transport hazardous materials like ethanol and crude oil. This was done after a comprehensive review of design features to improve puncture resistance and the safety of these shipments by rail. It wasn't until 2 years later, following the catastrophic accident in Lac Mégantic, that the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration finally initiated regulatory action. And as we know, the regulatory process is not a quick one. From what I understand, the best case estimate to complete the new tank car component of the rule, not the entire rule, is by the first quarter of 2015. Whether it's ethanol or crude oil, we need to be more nimble and responsive to our changing transportation system to ensure we have effective standards for businesses to keep and follow to keep everyone safe. We also need the Department of Transportation to be a leader when it comes to supporting aviation. For the past 6 years, this subcommittee has been making significant investments in NextGen, which is the Federal Aviation Administration's effort to modernize our air traffic control system. But I continue to hear concerns that the FAA has not been able to translate those investments into real changes for air transportation. And it's still not clear when these billions of dollars will mean shorter flights and lower fuel consumption and lower emissions. There's also a lot of interest in the development of unmanned aerial systems, and the Federal Aviation Administration is working on a plan for integrating these systems into our national airspace. According to FAA, we may see draft regulations on small, unmanned systems by the end of this year. I know the department will always put safety first, but I urge you to make progress in this arena. Mr. Secretary, I know you appreciate these challenges, and I look forward to working with you and hope you will use your position at the head of this department to expedite progress on these important issues and on the critical issues that are developing in transportation. But let me start by asking you about the GM recall. As we know, they last month recalled 1.6 million vehicles for faulty ignitions. It's been linked to 13 deaths, and it raises a lot of questions about why it took a decade, almost a decade, for the automaker to report a serious safety defect. We went through a similar episode with Toyota, and in response, in MAP 21, Congress increased the penalty for failure to report a safety defect from $16 million to $35 million. How do we get the industry to take timely safety reporting seriously?
Madam Chair, specifically on the GM question, we are conducting an ongoing aggressive investigation into GM and the timing of the recall. As a data-driven organization, NHTSA has worked with hundreds of millions of vehicles to ensure that the public is safe, and we will continue to do so. And over the last decade, there were complaints related to this particular vehicle, and despite 3 crash investigations and other research, the data was inconclusive. It just didn't point to a formal investigation. NHTSA is currently looking for ways to improve its own investigations and recall processes, lessons learned, and we will continue to do that as well as we're going through a formal investigation of this particular incident. What I would say to your more general point is that situations like this get the attention of the entire industry. And we will continue to be vigilant as an agency to ensure that the public is safe. We can't speculate as to the outcome of the investigation to this point, but you have my assurance that we will be very, very tough when we find that timeliness has been a problem.
Well, I think the recall raises some questions about why the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration failed to open a defect investigation, but despite 260 relevant complaints since 2003 and warnings from an agency special crash investigation report back in 2007. I want to know what happened here. Was there some key information missing in NHTSA's analysis of these complaints? Is there a larger problem with NHTSA's process and pattern analysis software? What are we looking at here?
Well, again, NHTSA is a data-driven organization, and there were 3 crash investigations that NHTSA went forward with. The results of those investigations were inconclusive. Now, a question that we are asking is whether and why, whether there was a timeliness issue with GM's bringing to our attention the issues regarding this ignition switch. It is our belief that had we known that there was an issue, that might have changed the outcome of those initial crash investigations. We still have to find our facts, and that's what we're doing today. And once we've discovered what the facts are, we will develop solutions both internally and externally designed to address those issues.
And we look forward to having a continuing conversation on that. I also wanted to ask a question. Obviously, everybody is following what's happened with the Malaysia Airlines jetliner. Really hard to believe that we haven't found any sign of the wreckage. This didn't happen under FAA's watch, of course, or under the jurisdiction of NTSB, but I wanted to hear your perspective on how FAA protects passengers. As both Senator Collins and I mentioned, we are investing billions of dollars in NextGen. It's an effort to modernize and improve our air traffic control system. Can you talk a little bit about how these investments will help the FAA improve its ability to track aircraft?
Well, essentially what NextGen promises is to take us from a World War II radar-based system to a 21st century GPS system, if you will. And for that reason, we do believe there will be opportunities to have better tracking of aircraft in not only our national airspace, but potentially in the global airspace. With specific respect to the Malaysian incident, I think it'd be premature of us to make a connection between the technology, and so I can't make any representations there, but I can absolutely tell you that we think there will be huge benefits to getting NextGen deployed.
Okay, including the ability to track.
Yes.
I only have a few seconds left. I wanted to ask you about transit safety. I'm really pleased to see that FTA's progress in standing up its safety offices. We know transit ridership is at its all-time high since 1956, but I wanted to talk with you about what the experience FTA has gained since the passage of MAP 21, what it's learned about local safety practices, and are there any areas of operations that you are particularly concerned about?
Thank you for the question, and it is really heartening to have the support of this Congress in trying to stand up a new safety function within FTA. We are in the process of scaling up our resources in that regard. We've hired 20-plus people to this point. I expect that there will be additional hires before the end of this calendar year. Our early experiences with beginning to develop the regulatory regime have been very, very good. We've gotten lots of feedback through our comment process to this point, and I expect that within the next several months we'll have more to say on that. We can certainly submit more for the record.
I think there's a number of members on this committee that are very interested in following that.
Good.
Mr. Secretary, every year the Maritime Administration is required to evaluate its policies on sexual harassment and sexual assault at the Merchant Marine Academy. The first evaluation occurred back in 2009, and it raised some very serious concerns. That year, there were 18 incidents in which students were sexually harassed by Academy staff or faculty. And even worse, 75% of the students said they were reluctant to report an incident through the chain of command. Now, Secretary THUD acknowledged this. He said the situation was unacceptable. He required swift action. The Inspector General is looking into the implementation of his action plan, but the next evaluation, which covers the 2011-2012 school year, is now very long overdue, and without that evaluation, it is impossible to determine if conditions have improved at the Academy. So I want to ask you today when we can expect to see that evaluation, and if you can share any of the preliminary findings.
Madam Chair, first of all, you will have that report in 2 weeks.
All right.
Over the course of the previous secretary, several steps have been implemented, and I want to highlight some of them just to further respond to your question. The safety of our midshipmen and women is of paramount importance to the Academy and to DOT. They've taken some steps here to prevent sexual harassment on campus, including hiring a sexual assault response coordinator and a civil rights director, revising its policy on sexual assault to allow for confidential reporting, establishing a 24/7 hotline for sexual assault reports, updating procedures for reporting sexual assaults that occur while midshipmen are at sea, and enhancing security measures on campus. There are other steps that have also been taken. We can provide a supplemental to the record, but what I would say to you is that I take this issue very seriously, and I believe that the situation as it was unacceptable as well, and you have my commitment to do everything I can to get it on a better course.
Okay, great. We expect that report in 2 weeks, and we will follow up with you on that. I also wanted to ask you today about the PHMSA user fee that you have in the budget. If that fee is not agreed to, how we are going to be able to move forward on things like the new tank car rule and other crude regulatory reforms. As you know, those kinds of things are hard to pass here, so I'm wondering how we're going to fund those. If we don't have that, I will submit that for the record because I want to focus on something else here. And before I do that, I do want to just mention I appreciate your department's request for $3.4 billion for bridges. We had a terrific accident in my state last year with the Skagit River collapsing, and saw firsthand what happens if a major artery is taken out with a bridge, and that is an infrastructure issue that we have to focus on. But in my last few minutes here, I really want to talk about the CTI schools and the fact that just a few months ago, the FAA made some very dramatic changes to the way they're hiring our air traffic controllers. And among those changes, the FAA now no longer relies on a pool of graduates from its collegiate training initiative, our CTI schools. The FAA has added a new test to screen candidates they call the biographical questionnaire. Well, I'm hearing from our CTI schools in my state, in Washington State, that they are very worried about their graduates, and I'm hearing from the graduates as well. One CTI graduate from Washington State graduated with high honors, passed an FAA test for initial qualification, has almost 5 years of service in the Air Force, and a commercial pilot certificate with an instrumental rating. That young man took this biographical questionnaire and failed it for reasons that are very unclear, and he's not the only one in this situation. So I want you to explain to us how the FAA has improved this process, if this kind of applicant that I just described and many others are failing this initial screening.
Well, the goal of this current hiring process was to open up the 1,300 or so positions the FAA was hiring for this year. There'll be another 1,700 spots available next year, and so the person that you were speaking of will have another opportunity next year. What we have found, however, is that the group of folks that typically apply to the FAA for air traffic controller positions tends to be rather limited, and so in this instance, the FAA took an opportunity to do a more broad opening of the aperture, if you will, to try to get a larger universe of applicants into the program. From a practical perspective, those who've been through the CTI program will have a leg up in the training process once they get through the first few rounds of the interview process, But this is an issue that I know is continuing to be dynamic, and we'll continue to engage with you on.
Well, I don't know how I go back to a young man with that kind of experience and say you get another chance next year. This is somebody who's put a lot of investment in this. We're seeing results from this first biographical questionnaire that 28,000 applicants took the test, only 2,200 passed. You just described how many people we need to hire. Nobody understands what this biographical questionnaire is evaluating, or why they're not making it through. I mean, normally if you take a test, somebody will say, well, here's the results, here's why you failed this test. We're not getting any of that. NATCA, our air traffic controller situation, is telling us as well that they are very concerned about this new process, and I would assume these rates of failure on this biographical questionnaire have to be concerning to you as well.
They are concerning. I will say to you, Senator, that we will. I'll have Michael Horta from the FAA reach out directly to you about this this test. But my understanding was that a broad array of stakeholders within FAA were part of developing the test. So it'd be surprising to me if some of the elements within the FAA are raising questions now. But I'll take a look at it.
Okay, I want to find out why this rate of success.
Sure.
This is horrendous. And by the way, the young man that I just talked about turns 31, so he's not going to be eligible to go again, as you described. So, you know, we've got a lot of veterans who are not making it through this biographical questionnaire, and I think this is an area we have got to reevaluate quickly. I want to understand what the partnership with the CTIs are today. I want to understand what this biographical questionnaire is. I want to know why people are failing, not just that they're failing, and what this is adding to the quality of the people that we're considering for this program. We have a lot of air traffic controllers we need out there. The age of these folks they're aging out of the system. We need to get these people hired. The CTIs are an important part of this, and this to me is really troubling. So I want to follow up with you on this. It's extremely important. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate your coming before our committee today. And I want to remind all of our colleagues, we will leave the hearing record open for 1 week for additional questions. And this hearing is now adjourned until Wednesday, April 2nd at 10 a.m. We will hold a hearing on HUD's budget request. Thank you.